Ladies and gentlemen, our program will now begin. Please welcome the CEO of Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you for coming. I'm Karen Tucker, CEO at the Churchill Club, and tonight's program is called The Collection of Online Consumer Data, the Good, the Bad, the Unknown. And we present this event in honor of Data Privacy Day, which occurs each year on January 28th, and it's all about making people aware of new and important privacy and data protection matters. We are very privileged to have with us a remarkable group of speakers: Jim Adler, Nick Bicanic, Jules Cohen, Nicole Ozer, Paul Schwartz, and of course our moderator, Jules Polonetsky. Welcome all of you, and thank you very much for being with us tonight. Not only do we have a distinguished panel, but we also have an amazing audience, really a who's who of experts and deep thinkers in this topic area. And I want to thank you for your presence, and I hope that many of you will participate in the audience Q&A later on. Our program partner and sponsor is Microsoft Trustworthy Computing, and we thank them, especially Tracy Ferris and also Doug Free, for their leadership and support. Our next event will be on Tuesday, February 7 in Mountain View, presenting Wael Ghonim, who is the former Google executive who sparked a revolution in Egypt through the use of social media. And he will be interviewed by NPR correspondent Laura Seidel. And this event will be his only Bay Area public appearance this year, so I hope you'll make it. For those of you who aren't as familiar with us, we are a member-supported, not-for-profit organization with the mission to encourage innovation and economic growth. If you would like to consider supporting us in some form, please visit our website for options at churchillclub.org. We'd appreciate that very much. Thank you. And my last announcement, if you are tweeting, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, #Churchill Club, and you will find other Twitter codes in your printed programs. It is time now to introduce our impressive moderator, Jules Polonetsky. Jules spends all of his days and at least some of his nights working on matters relating to keeping people safer online and helping companies responsibly take advantage of the opportunities. He's now with the Future of Privacy Forum as co-chair and director. In the past, he's played a number of roles in the online privacy area. He was chief privacy officer at two companies, AOL and DoubleClick. He was also Consumer Affairs Commissioner in New York City. He serves on a committee for Department of Homeland Security and a number of boards, including trustee, which is quite well represented in our audience here tonight. Jules, thank you. We look forward to the fresh and forward-thinking conversation that you have in store for us. And remember, audience, if there's something that isn't addressed by the panel, you'll have an opportunity to raise those issues during Q&A, so I encourage you to do that. Let's now welcome Jules Polonetsky.
Well, thank you, and exciting to see so many familiar faces and so many friends, which means that some of my old jokes are not going to be available to be used because some of you have heard them, but it's really exciting to be here. I do have to correct one thing. I was on trustees board during the days when they were a lowly not-for-profit, struggling to get by, where being on the board meant that you got lunch when you showed up at the board meeting. I'd like to be on the board now that they're a venture-backed company with hundreds of employees and stock options and stuff like that. But I think my privacy timing hasn't been that good. I went to AOL right after the Time Warner merger because that was like a big thing, right? That made a lot of really good sense, and so that was a good time to be there. And I joined DoubleClick right after the Abacus merger when the ad market collapsed. And I'm now spending full time doing privacy. For those of you who make a living doing this, it doesn't portend well for our careers. It does feel like there's a revolution going on, maybe not in the same way that we see in the Mideast where countries are toppling, but if you read the newspapers, there is a fearsome uprising just about every day. I mean, just this week, Google's changed its privacy policy. Their blogs and the stories are, are up in arms about it. And there's always a Facebook story, and there's you name it. There seems to be an outrage of the day, and certainly it feels like there's an uprising. And I guess the question is, are the users rising up? We saw this giant uprising against SOPA and PIPA and websites, blacking out things. Are we going to see users at any point, because of something that a company here in the audience, a company that matters out there does, outrage them so much that we see a giant change in practices? We've seen companies roll back their practices when the outrage has been too much. But I think it's perhaps at that point today where data has become so much of our lives that we're so dependent on these companies, and they're so intertwined that we may, for the first time, see users really rising up. And so we're going to plunge into some of these conversations. Jim to my left, a lot of you know, local San Franciscan. Jim is the CPO and the general manager of data systems at Intelius. And so Jim's sort of both on the data side of the world, but out there actively talking about privacy, talking about managing reputation. And so we're going to understand how that works. I met Nick just a little while ago. He reached out to the Future of Privacy Forum, a bold thing for a startup to do, and introduced himself and said, look, I'm doing location-sensitive stuff, but I'm doing it in a privacy-smart way. And so he's our entrepreneur, small business, real person, only guy not in a suit, because he actually understands technology here. Jules Cohen, for many years, Jules was such a good sport, because we were on panels together, and I was a little older and had been doing this a little longer, and so he was the other Jules. But as he's risen up the ranks at Microsoft and increasingly taking on more senior and more responsible roles, I'm starting to feel like the other Jules. Nicole has been at the ACLU for 7 years. Didn't know she went to law school with Edan, and has been an enormously visible face leading some of these uprisings that we're going to talk about. Paul Schwartz has done some of the most interesting academic privacy work in the last couple of years. They're all sorts of interesting academics, and so many of them spend their days in a privacy ivory tower, and we respect and we appreciate that that's what they need to do to get tenure, and that's what they need to do to get published. What Paul has done remarkably is he's done work that has been seriously received in the academic community, but it's been incredibly interesting to those of us who are out there trying to understand how to draw some of the lines. His recent paper about redefining or understanding how to deal with personal information, PII 2.0, has been phenomenally received in sort of the CPO and the data community. And so we'll talk a little bit about whether personal information in this world is a little bit different. I'm going to let them say a little bit of something, and then we're going to plunge into conversation. And I'm known for calling on people in the audience, so beware. If I catch your eye and you look interesting, we may draw you into the conversation. So Jim, you're in the data business, but you're in the privacy business, and you're out there engaging with advocates and tweeting. And is this a risky thing to do? Is this a bold thing to do? Tell us, what's the story here?
I think it's a vitally important thing to do. For those that don't know, Intelius is a direct-to-consumer provider of information about people and businesses. I am the Chief Privacy Officer, as Jules said, and I also run the data systems team, so I'm a big data guy that also does privacy work. And we have billions of records on people, probably everyone in this room, that is public. And we are direct-to-consumer, so people are interested in other people. And I think social media has shown us that people are interested in other people. And I think it's really important for us to not just innovate, but innovate responsibly and listen to the folks around the table and around this room to make sure we do innovate responsibly. So I think a lot about big data ideas and privacy. I blog about it, jimadler.me. You can check it out. And feel free to argue, because I think it's important that we have a spirited discussion about really, you use the word revolution. I think you're right. There's a lot of disruption going on, and it's going to take smart people to figure it out.
Nick, you going to be able to hold your own today with these policy wonks?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that I'm here. I'm the, the emperor has no clothes guy. Although, actually, on the subject of clothes, Karen did say, we were doing this little briefing last week of, ask questions about the event, and I think it primarily helps people like me because I'm kind of new to it. And they said, wear what you wear to work. So I thought I'd take her at her word, but then I figured that people might be freaked out if I showed up in board shorts and flip-flops, so this is me dressed up, just so you know. But yes, I don't think I should have any problems in calling a spade a spade. I mean, at the end of the day, by its very nature, when you deal with location, you're dealing with something that makes the virtual world real. So it's a big difference sharing a picture of the food you're eating or a particular place that you're eating versus your exact location at a certain point in time. And the way in which you build products to satisfy these kinds of pain points. I think we have a responsibility as developers, not just small ones, but big ones, or other people in the room, to create products that actually solve problems and that are built on privacy as a basic design point without sacrificing elegance and simplicity, and that's one of the things that I want to talk about.
What's the deal with all these people sharing food? I love social media. I'm friends with most of you in this room. If you're not, let's be friends. But I don't take pictures of my food. Is it a fetish sort of thing? I mean, I get if it's something in a funny shape, but do any of you share food, pictures of elegant dishes? No? Yes. So yes, Barb, you have shared food. What's the point of the sharing food?
It's about the unique and bizarre.
Okay. So it's a particularly interesting dish, and there are people who are responding to your food posts. There's.
When we were in Mexico City, we saw some fairly exotic stuff.
Yes, it was Day of the Dead in Mexico City, which coincided with the annual Data Commissioners Conference. I didn't plan the schedule. Jules, you're here, I guess, officially to give us the responsible company that's figured out privacy and is doing it right and employing lots of smart people to have good processes in place.
You're kind. I would just like to say that Jim Dempsey, who's sitting here in the front, was on a panel similar to this last year and said something to the effect of, there are many people in the room who could be sitting here, and it's kind of an honor to be the one who got the opportunity. So I wanted to say, now you're there. But and I wanted to thank Churchill and everybody else. Yeah, we hope to be considered the responsible one or one of the responsible ones in the room. From our perspective, Karen mentioned earlier that this event is the trustworthy computing part of Microsoft is involved with this event. Trustworthy computing has been around for this is the 10-year anniversary of trustworthy computing. And for those who don't know, trustworthy computing at Microsoft is the part of the company that thinks about security, it thinks about privacy, thinks about reliability, thinks about some of the elements that build trust in these services that we're all using. We do that because we don't think people are going to use the services unless we've engendered their trust. And so focusing on these areas is a way to do that. In privacy in particular, we think about transparency as a way to really begin to grow the trust with the users. So we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the day.
Nicole, do you look at Microsoft as a responsible company that has smart processes in place?
I'm here to poke holes in what the three gentlemen to my right say in the most sweet yet tenacious way I have been doing for 7+ years. So that will continue tonight. But I'm excited to be here. I hear you all don't want us to agree, so we'll do our best. That was some of the feedback from last year, so we'll try our best to have it be engaging and interesting. But I, too, am excited to be here tonight and definitely interested in talking more about the uprisings that are occurring. For the past 4 years, some of my primary work has been to develop and lead the ACLU's national online privacy campaign called Demand Your Rights. And I'm very excited with what we've been able to accomplish, and this week in particular has been quite a banner week for privacy with the Supreme Court decision. So I'm very interested in talking more about things that are happening now and things that are on the horizon and getting great questions from you all. So.
Paul, are you going to feel left out if she doesn't poke at your theories at all?
It's my alma mater. But,
Okay. Well, I guess do your thing. I think what I can add to the conversation is the perspective of an academic who teaches privacy law. And what I would say by way of introduction is I also teach tort law, which is the study of civil wrongs, things like battery and negligence and medical malpractice. And in tort law, we look at a lot of cases involving steam engines and locomotives that generate sparks and that put things like piles of hay on fire. And so we look at all these old cases, and then finally the law of negligence, really around the 1950s, 1960s, finally gets sorted out and takes its modern form. And so I also wonder whether for privacy, if we're really just at the start of this process, and we're living in the age of the spark-generating locomotives that are creating these privacy harms to people and data security harms to people, and we're struggling the same way the English and American judges of that earlier 19th century era are struggling.
So the big news this week, again, has been sort of like a rush week for privacy. We have US v. Jones. We have the Europeans tomorrow coming out with their proposed regulation. We have Google privacy policy changes. We have, issue after issue. So let's start with the Supreme Court. We have the State of the Union happening tonight, which you are all here and instead of, which is really a phenomenal and noble thing. So let's give you some noble and lofty thinking as well. As the academic, you for sure grabbed the decision off the press when the Supreme Court handed it down. Clearly important on the government intrusion into personal life side. Anything we should learn on the private sector side so the government can track me in this ubiquitous way, perhaps because they've intruded into my vehicle, or, but what do you think the folks in the private sector ought to be learning or getting from this case?
Well, I think one thing to think about is our Constitution of the United States only protects people, our Bill of Rights, if there's state action. And so this decision does not apply to the private sector. This is quite different than the situation in many European countries where the constitutional rights of privacy do apply to private sector organizations. So what this kind of tells me for private sector companies that are here, we live in an age of international data flows, and trying to harmonize our approach with that of Europeans, for example, is going to be complex because they view the law quite differently than we do.
Well, so the crux of this case in many ways was location and tracking location. And one of the things I took from it was, you saw the members of the court really uncomfortable with the notion that the ubiquity of the tracking, the pervasiveness of the tracking, that somehow added something to it. And we've got companies in this room and up on this panel who are dealing with location. And I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago when you first started seeing some of the popular location services, everybody was, we get it. Location is, that's pretty sensitive. We're going to be careful. It's going to be done with your permission. And in the last couple of years, last couple of months certainly, I've seen companies starting to be a bit more flexible. I'll give you one example. If I'm web surfing using my mobile device, or if I'm using an app on my device, those apps, many of them are free. That's great. They're ad supported. That's great. The ads seem to be very precisely targeted because the app has my location. Okay, I guess if the app is smart, why shouldn't the ad be smart? But then are they handing that location on to other companies or to other apps, or using it later and then creating a map of everywhere I've been, which starts feeling very much like surveillance? Nick, what's your take? Are the sloppy actors going to blow up location for the good actors? Are we going to see Senator Franken, demanding privacy protections for location that maybe impact the bad guys, but also make life difficult for anybody? Is location a hot button?
I mean, I definitely think it's a hot button. I think it probably won't be this year that something massive happens on a legislative level, or rather a blow up in the public space, which causes the mass of users to suddenly demand different kinds of rights. I tell you one thing that I tend to focus quite a bit more on, by virtue of being a small, nimble startup that doesn't have time to pay attention to perhaps some lofty ideals of what we could or should do. We focus quite a lot on what our users want to do. In other words, we try and solve pain points for users. And one thing that's quite interesting is that users don't read privacy sort of statements or policies like ever. So now we all know this, but it's one thing to consider, well, what does tracking mean on a sort of intellectual or self-determination level? It's another thing to consider, what does tracking mean to the users? Because, for example, what does tracking mean to a user that uses a smartphone app? I tell you what it means. It means it destroys their battery life. Therefore, it blows. Now, there's a second issue there, which is you layer privacy on top of that. And sure, there are some people who might go, that's kind of a bad thing. Problem is, you have to understand it in order to know how bad a thing it might be. So so I don't digress too much into what we do and how we do it differently. I mean, I think tracking is very important. I think it's a bad idea to design an application which works from the point of view of tracking, because it rarely solves the main pain point for users. It solves a revenue pain point for certain types of companies, but that's kind of an ass-backward way to try and solve a user's problem, which is ultimately what I think as developers we should all have a responsibility to doing.
So if people aren't reading those privacy policies, what's a company to do? I mean, Nicole, do you want icons on ads? Do you want, should my phone vibrate when something's happening? What do we, Ryan Kalo, our friend at Stanford, has talked about visceral notice, that let's not throw out privacy policies. Let's look for ways. We know how to warn people with red signals and sirens, and maybe we need things that connect with people. So we're talking a smartphone. Do we want it to vibrate, or should it read me the policy, or what's the solution if it's not privacy policy when it's me trying to tell you what's going on?
Well, there's clearly a lot of problems with privacy policies. This isn't the first panel that's talked about the fact that people don't read privacy policies, or even if they read them, they don't understand it. I think there was research a few years ago that it would take the average person over 200 hours, just to go through the privacy policies of services that they use on a regular basis. So, there's a lot of discussion. The Federal Trade Commission, many people have talked about some solutions in terms of at-the-moment notice, things that are better in terms of notice and transparency. But I do think that only gets us so far, that there needs to be notice and transparency, but there also have to be real controls on how information is collected, how it's used, and how it's disclosed. So, we could have an entire roundtable on transparency, which has happened in many places. But I think that there's limits to that in terms of how much users are really going to understand, even if there is notice that's better. And so I really focus both on the transparency issue, but also on the need to have real controls for users and real user control over how information is used and disclosed.
Well, Carrier IQ was in the news recently. This is the company that a blogger discovered was on many, many phones, sending back diagnostic information to carriers so that when your phone gets disconnected because you're tweeting, they understand why. But nobody knew about this other than people who pay attention to this very closely. The blogger didn't know about it, the media didn't know about it, and there was a giant outcry. The carriers say something in their privacy policy like, we collect diagnostic information. They didn't say, and here's the name of the company we use. I guess if they had, nobody would have read that anyway. And yet we have this giant alarm. Now, maybe they were collecting more than they should have, but it seems like most of the alarm was that this was being collected and being sent back in the first place. Are companies damned if they do and damned if they don't? What's your advice, Jim?
Well, I think that awareness and control is really a big part of this. I think there needs to be there is this expectation that we have. I think the Carry IQ thing was kind of blown out of proportion, to be honest. I mean, you're using a cell phone. You know you're dealing with your carrier. The carrier has many contractors, subcontractors that they use. There's a lot of data being collected. I think the question always comes down to who are the players involved? Do I have an expectation that this is a private space? And communication is a private space. And then what are the potential pitfalls or perils that could come from this data falling into the wrong hands? And I think if you think about it along those axes, it kind of unearths some truths. The space in that case was clearly private. The players themselves, outside of some government intervention or asking for that data around digital due process, which we've talked about. And then what ultimately are the perils there? What can really happen? What can go sideways? And if there are, and I think ultimately we're going to get into this discussion of data use. What are okay data uses? What are not so okay data uses? We have a huge precedent for that in the Fair Credit Reporting Act from 1970, where we've talked about certain permissible purposes need certain regulations, like housing and employment and other business purposes. And so I think we get kind of hung up around access and the data being out there without thinking clearly about what are the potential perils around players that may get access to that data.
Are there times where we just don't want to be asking because it's not that important to people, or most of us aren't going to pay attention to it? I mean, when is it okay not to ask? When can we collect data by default? So clearly for things like, I'm going to email you, I'm going to call you, I really want to be asked, right? And maybe I want to know more about behavioral advertising and be asked or turn it on or off, whatever it is. But are there, analytics never used to be a big issue, right? Analytics was like, yeah, tell me about the behavioral advertising. I remember when I was at DoubleClick, I visited, we were in all kinds of trouble. I visited data regulators and tell us about the behavioral stuff. We don't care about the analytics. We get that you're improving the website, blah, blah, blah. But today, folks are calling for do not track, and it means to certainly advocates, don't collect it at all. The Europeans have said anything other than the main operational purpose of the site, you need to ask the user permission to set the cookie. And so is it, do we want people thinking about analytics and maybe saying no because they don't see the need for it? Can we assume certain uses of data? Can we assume that my carrier should get diagnostic data? And don't even ask me about that. Of course you should get diagnostic data. Should websites be able to have analytics? A lot of advocates who are part of the do not track debate say, no, who knows what can happen? I don't trust the company. The government might get it. I don't want even analytics. Nicole, Jules?
There's a lot of, this is another discussion that's going around, but to me the problem is who decides whether or not to actually give notice or to let somebody know about it. If it's the company, they might assume that of course everyone understands this. It didn't just come up in the carrier IQ situation, it came up in the Apple situation, which was a huge story. You talk to any technologists, and they were flabbergasted by the fact that this Apple story got so much attention, that there were, Senator Franken had hearings, that there was so much focus on this, because to most technologists or to people who understand how mobile phones work, of course cell towers are getting access to location information. That's how they function. But the general public had very little understanding of this, very little understanding that information was being accessed, collected, how long it was being retained, which is upwards of 2+ years for AT&T on all location information. So, to me, I worry who's making the decisions about who to tell and what to tell, because if you're leaving it in the company's hands or in the engineer's hands, what they think is intuitive may be very different than what consumers really understand or would want to know.
I think I'd take it back to this. There's this sort of question of the equilibrium that we're looking for here. There are a number. We could ask the same question about a variety of uses, and we're in this period now of muddling through, of trying to find the equilibrium, given all of the new opportunities and possibilities that are available to us. And I think companies are trying to figure out what things are appropriate and how to tell people about what they're doing and such. But even in that context of disequilibrium, there are a few things that I think most people should be doing, or companies should be doing. Implementing a strong corporate governance program to make sure that companies are working to keep the promises that they actually are making. So we promise to do X. here's the program that's in place to actually keep those promises, to build out corporate standards around data use and to hire people whose job it is to try and enforce those standards. Those are the kinds of investments that we've made, and we hope that other people in the community will make to work to keep the promises we make during this period when, frankly, the use issues are very much in flux, and folks like those in the panel and on the room are struggling with what's okay and what's not.
Well, imagine if your phone had asked you, and if Google or Apple or Microsoft had asked you, we'd like to log every time you turn on your phone the Wi-Fi routers that we can see, including yours, because we're building a global database of where all these routers are to generally improve the GPS services. So will you please broadcast to us so we can build this database of all the Wi-Fi routers that you pass by? What would you say? You'd be like, what? No. And we then would not have a fairly useful service that none of us, knew maybe existed unless you were in the weeds. And most of us use when we turn on our phone and it looks for the Wi-Fi routers and it gives us GPS more quickly. But can you imagine what would happen if we asked people? They would probably have said no. Or IE crashes, not often. Firefox crashes, and it pops up something, right? It says, would you please send us some diagnostic information so that we understand and try to improve the browser? Confess. What do you say? Do you say yes, Microsoft, yes, Firefox? No, you're all shaking your heads no.
No, yes for Firefox, no for Chrome.
Well, sorry? But honest answers. A lot of you are saying no, right? And you're like, clearly this is good for you.
Interestingly, just as a totally minor point, on Android, this actually happens. On Android phones, there's a minor point, but basically on an iPhone, there's location. On Android, you're split between satellite and network location. And the example that Jules gave, which is gathering Wi-Fi data, that falls on the network location. If you tap that on your Android phone, you're actually specifically asked. It said, you're consenting to sending Google information on na. And sadly, the answer is most people, I know I'm kind of echoing what I said before, forgetting the pun, most people say yes, because it improves their experience of using the phone, and they kind of go, they don't care. Now again, I'm not talking about the people in this room as most people. I'm talking about, the people who buy these phones and who we all make a living off of. Those are the most people, and they don't care.
So my argument is most people say yes because it's continue and it's pre-checked.
Yes,
so
yes, no, I agree. Yes.
I wonder whether they're actually sitting there saying, I'm glad to be participating in this global experiment that's improving GPS. Because when it comes to the browsers, my understanding is that a very, very low percentage, like 3% of users, are noble enough to say, here's the crash data, improve the browser, because they don't see any immediate something for them, or they feel maybe it'll slow something down or the like. Paul, you look like you were going to jump in here.
What I'd say is great point by Jules, or I guess the other Jules.
Thank you.
You're welcome, about corporate governance. And I think there are two elements of corporate governance that should be discussed. One of which is I think corporations now have a general public policy obligation to add to the knowledge that the public has. And I actually have seen ads by companies where you kind of read it and you realize they just want the public to know about, example given, how IP addresses function. And so I think corporations have to actively be involved in educating the public, and even in educating kind of thought leaders in the public about how some of these products work, including analytics. The second point is in the intelligence kind of community, one thing that they do is they red team things, and they have a kind of black hat people who will look at situations and decide where the vulnerabilities are. And that's now part of data security. I think you really need privacy red teams as well, where companies will look at products and have other people who look at it and say, what are the vulnerabilities? What will the public think about it? And have it and look at it really systematically. What do we do if they find out that we've outsourced this? Will they be happy? What will be our answer? And so I think increased publicity and public education is important, and also this kind of red team approach to governance.
So is Google's good to know campaign sort of in that line?
I think it's very important. Actually, that's what I was thinking of. I saw the ad. I think it was in the New York, and I read through it and said, well, I know this. And then it felt good for a moment. And then I thought, oh, okay, I get it.
I think, though, Jules, the way that you posed the question also sort of reveals sometimes when companies do give notice or are giving transparency about something, they're only giving maybe a portion of the story. So, for example, let's say, will you sign up to do this so that we can make your service faster, or we can deliver you, X, Y, Z. But they're not necessarily saying how long they're retaining the information, and that information could be shared or disclosed for many other purposes, whether it be the government or a third party in civil litigation. So, while I said that control is very important, I think that if there is transparency and notice, the real story needs to be given so that people can make as informed a choice as they can. And when they are given a choice, they should actually be able to say yes or no, versus a lot of times we're seeing some of the industry standards being that a pop-up notice will come up and you can say yes forever, or you can say not now, but you can't say no, I never want this.
I think that notice and consent, great stuff. I think it just scratches the surface, though, of really what has to happen. Let me just tell you a quick story about sort of where we've come from. I joined the company about a little over 3 years ago, and we were just a people search company, background checks, things like that. And I was at an unconference, I think, Jim, I think you were running it, and Sally Applin, who's a privacy advocate and also an anthropologist, she came up to me and said, the problem with Intelius, you guys are all about voyeurism and not enough about narcissism. And I said, that's like genius, And she's like, what about my data? How much of my data do you have? I'd like to see my data. I'd like to get some control around my data. And, I really took that to heart. I said, she's absolutely right. I think it was something like, why does it cost $50 to get a background check on myself? And I think that's right. And it took a couple years, but we've come out with this product called TrueRep, and it's for free. You can look at your own background check. You can look at your own information. Because I think at the end of the day, you need to have some awareness before you can have control. And we sort of sit at the retail end of this data supply chain. So we are voracious gatherers of data, and we sell it one report at a time or make it available one report at a time. And so our view is if you can see your profile, you will know what's publicly known about you. You will be the first to know, not the last to know. And I think this product, and this is a whole fork of the company now, is focused on empowering people to better understand all the data that's out there. We have purview to it. People should be able to have access to it. And then once they have access to it, people said, well, I'd really like to suppress my latest contact information. That's what's most important and sensitive to me. And so we provided that privacy control at least within our Intelius network. We have about 60-70% of the market. So we felt that's a reasonably good, valuable service that we can deliver. And I think we're just getting started. And I think a lot in the company were like, you really want to do that? And it was sort of, we had to kind of come around to how important it is to empower people and trust your customer not to freak out and actually enjoy the service, and actually you'll get a lot more feedback on what else you should add to it.
Do some people freak out?
Yeah, they do. And I think that's important because I think we're going through this. I think, Jules, you mentioned equilibrium. Well, before you have equilibrium, you have to have disequilibrium. You have to have things out of balance before you can find the balance. And so I think it's important that you let people freak out a little bit and understand that we want to hear from customers, we want to hear from users, what really matters. And for example, the latest contact suppression actually came from the domestic violence community. They're the ones who said, we don't want to completely opt out because then the offender will just go to another site. We'd rather you just suppress the latest contact information and let the trail run cold, and then offenders would not be able to find these women, typically women. Another beautiful suggestion from the community. Did we come up with that? No. And so I think you learn a lot from disequilibrium.
Jules?
One thought just to follow on something that Paul said regarding guidance. I mean, there are a number of kinds of ways that corporations, I think, try to get out there and tell some of the stories about how they're trying to do the right things with data. We come and talk to audiences like this and talk about how we have a governance program, hired our first chief privacy officer over a decade ago. We've been building that program out, investing. But there are other kinds of guidance, to other communities. Something else that we're doing now around Data Privacy Day is offering some guidance to consumers about how to better think about their reputation online, how to better manage, the aggregation of data that's out there about them. Some of that data is public, some of that data is private, some of that data may have, joint permissions and such. We did a little bit of research recently, and some of you have the research documents there, and asked some questions about how people think about this set of data, this aggregation of data. And we asked a question, how many people have taken a step, one step even, just a step, to manage this large profile, this set of data that's out there about you, perhaps disaggregated. And 91% of the people said they'd done something. So there's some awareness out there. People have done something. But if you ask them, questions about how often they're actively thinking about managing that information, it's a much smaller number. You see less than half the people actively thinking about managing that information. So, there's certainly work to be done, to Jim's point. But during this period of disequilibrium, I think it's important to be, giving recommendations to consumers, but also talking to different kinds of audiences about how best to manage these risks and how best to understand what's going on and make choices during this period.
So for a long time, one of the reasons why companies didn't want to show profiles and data that was available was there was this concern that not only would people freak out, but they might actually opt out, and then you'd lose all your customers who'd say, delete me. It's been interesting to notice what has happened as companies have started showing you clickstream profiles. Microsoft, Yahoo, Google will show you your clickstream profile if you click through from the icon on the banner ad to the privacy policy to the ad preference manager, and you can then see that you are a sports, finance, whatever sort of person. So I've been trying to keep track of what statistics, like what do people do when they get there and they see that they are the sports whatever person. Do they freak out? The numbers that Google shared with me at some point were that of every 15 users who get there, now these are probably privacy motivated, they took the trouble to manage their way through this process, 10 do nothing, 4 actually tweak, change it, they want it to be right, and only 1 actually opts out. And so I'm wondering whether the solution, perhaps, to some of the privacy challenge is going to be less people deleting data and more get me right. We all seem to be sort of fine with Amazon tracking my books and my videos, stuff that is really sensitive. I mean, the biggest civil libertarians in Washington, I'll tell you, are not any of us. It's the librarians who really don't want the government knowing your books. I mean, they are, fierce. But we all seem to be really comfortable with Amazon, and we didn't have to read the privacy policy. It kind of says, we're tracking your books to sell you more books. This is what we think you might like. This is what we think everyone likes. So is the future going to be people debating which companies get them right, or are we going to have this sort of pushback of, I don't want you trying to know me? Is personalization going to lead to people feeling kind of hemmed in and controlled? Or are we going to have people debating who does a better job at getting you right? Nicole, you don't seem to like that whole setup there.
Well, I am one of those people that clicks through to those ad preferences, and I'm very excited that both Google and Yahoo both think I'm a 65-year-old man. So I don't know what that says about my searching, but they definitely don't get me right, and I sort of am excited about that and pat myself on the back. In terms of the book issues, I would also say that we did pass the first law in the country, the California Reader Privacy Act, which now safeguards digital and offline books, both for third parties and government access here in California. So that took us 2.5 years, but it went into effect on January 1st. So that's very exciting sort of in terms of seeing a new privacy law move forward, which hasn't happened in a lot of states and federally for a long time. I guess I'm not the one to ask whether or not consumers will be happy when people get them right. There's research from many different parts of academia, from industry, from sort of all sectors about behavioral targeting, and the numbers remain that most consumers feel very uncomfortable with behavioral targeting, with targeted advertising, that they don't think it's such a benefit to them, and they don't like being targeted and seeing those ads. So I guess from what I've seen and from what I experience, I'm obviously a privacy lawyer, I don't think people will be so excited for it to be getting right. I think the more that they see targeted advertising, the more it becomes transparent to them, the more there's going to be pushback. We've seen it grow.
Well, with that same study, the one maybe you're referencing is the one that Chris Hufnagel, Paul, you were involved with that one? Chris Hufnagel and Joe Turo did, and it made the case that people didn't like behavioral advertising, but also they didn't like the content being tailored for them. So here we are with all the search engines competing furiously to try to make results more relevant. Google is pulling in my Google Plus results so that my friends' comments and so forth are also in my Google results. Microsoft and Bing and Facebook have an integration. The search engines seem to believe that they'll make it easier for me to find the stuff I'm looking for if more personal results are available.
It works.
Does it work?
I mean, it works. And people may not like to be tracked, but they don't like paying even more. So there is this tracker charge discussion, and you see it happening. Pandora is either free or with ads or paid, and I think you're going to see more of this discussion and this choice being delivered to consumers, so that the companies providing the services can actually pay for them. I mean, I'm sure if you said, hey, it's going to be free no matter what, would you rather be tracked or not? They'll say, I'd rather not be tracked.
Has anybody bought the new Amazon Kindle? There's a cheap one that is ad supported, presumably also based on what you do, and then there's a more expensive one. Has anybody bought the subsidized? Barb, did you get the ad supported one or the more expensive privacy friendly one?
I got the more expensive privacy friendly one because it was for my teenage daughter and I did not want to have her have to deal with that.
I love that informed choice.
But I liked actually having the choice, and we actually discussed it with my husband, is what makes sense. And he would have taken, he hates ads, but he hates paying more money.
Thank you. Love it. Love it.
There's an extra, I mean, it's interesting you touched on the whole introducing social data into search. There's an interesting that's an extra dimension of privacy, which is the social graph. Because actually, we can spend all this time talking about our own privacy, but every time I do something that might seem innocuous, like, ooh, it's a new app, I think I'll log in with Facebook Connect. Well, I'm not only giving Facebook access, but also the app makers access to data that's not just mine, but there's data that people who chose to share stuff with me shared that was theirs. It's actually an interesting dimension to consider. It's very complicated to figure out what this means. And by the way, I mean, Facebook, I don't mean to punch at Facebook. LinkedIn, Google+, and so forth have the same kinds of issues. Facebook is just the biggest sort of elephant in the room, so it's easy to point at them. One thing I think is going to help a lot in this respect is oddly relevance, although not in the way that you used it. Oversharing of the kind that, loaded word, but that's okay, of the kind that people do quite a lot of, and perhaps at various stages of growth, all social networks have encouraged for obvious reasons.
You mean those food pictures?
Well, for example, or lots of other things. Essentially, the thing about signal-to-noise ratio in any kind of sharing, and I'm not talking about location right now because it's very different, is that if the signal-to-noise ratio decreases, then what happens then, if there's very little signal, is that there's a lot less relevance going on there. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is that in the absence of understandable privacy controls, what's happening is that people are sharing less and less relevant stuff. So if you're sharing way more of stuff that's way less relevant, people will start to wake up, and they already are. People will wake up to the fact that, wait a second, we need to dial up the relevance. Well, how do we do that? One of the ways we do that is by dialing up and understanding a bit more about privacy. There you go.
So, look, lots of the people in this room are active in the social media world. Should we be preaching less privacy and more shape your reputation so that you put your best foot forward? I liked the Facebook timeline, and the reason I liked it is I said, you know what, this data was all there. If someone was looking me up, if a friend of mine was looking me up and they just wanted to scroll down, they could have seen this. Now, they might have had to click a bunch of times, but it was all there. Facebook has shown me that this is all there and said, shape it to make it look like the best you, because maybe those food dishes should not be the thing on the top of your profile. Maybe you want to highlight who you are and you know, what you're good at. And so is it more about reputation, and should we be looking to make sure that companies give us better controls to shape our reputation, or do we want them, you know, helping us lock it down? Last year or 2 years ago, Microsoft did some research that showed something that I think we all knew, but it documented it, that hiring managers and college recruiters were all looking up users to make decisions about recruiting them or, you know, or hiring them. Given that we're not going to stop looking at each other, should we be getting better tools to shape? Reputation.com has been doing well. You've got this TrueRep product. Should we be talking a little less about privacy, is that cat out of the bag, and more how people can shape who they are?
It's control, isn't it? I mean, isn't reputation shaping some level of control?
Yeah, but when you do that, if you shape, you're not really shaping who you are. You're shaping who you want to appear like, which is not the same thing.
Well, but you put on that little better set of clothing today.
No, I'm not.
You know, that was fair to do.
But over time, they should converge, shouldn't they? I mean, you can't fake it for that long. I mean, maybe you can fake it for that long.
I suspect that the millions.
Maybe that's where I'll fake it.
The millions of users of dating sites will probably argue otherwise, because one of the biggest problems that I hear, at least, not that I've used those, is that they go, "Oh my God, I can't believe you look totally different. What's going on?" But yeah, I mean, in a professional context, in a professional context, I'm sure that happens as well. But no, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to note that there's a spectrum of harms here, and there's a spectrum of people's needs to deal with those harms. Some people are much more comfortable with the openness. Some people are much more comfortable with more closed nature. Reputation is one of those harms people are trying to manage. Another data point in this survey from this year was around the impact of one person's behaviors on another person. And we saw more evidence of those kinds of harms regarding employment and regarding college admissions and the like that were resulting from somebody doing something online that impacted somebody else. So that's certainly in there. But people need to be thinking about, where am I on that spectrum? What's my comfort level? What tools do I want to go deploy?
So once upon a time, the solution to some of the privacy issues was, it's okay, I don't have your name, it's just a cookie, it's anonymous, and it's de-identified. And over time, that's become under a lot of stress. The FTC says, well, maybe an IP address. The Europeans increasingly consider larger and different kinds of data to be personal. Paul, would you share for us a bit your thinking around the stresses on the definition of personal information and whether that model still works?
Yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to. So with Dan Sola of George Washington University, we've published a paper about PII 2.0. So the really key concept for privacy is personally identifiable information. But as it turns out, the law has utterly failed to come up with a uniform definition of what personal information is, while at the same time saying that privacy law is like an on-off switch. And if you have personal information, you get privacy protection, and if you don't, no privacy protection. But what we found is it's actually a malleable category, and it's a category that changes with technology, where different kinds of information might become identifiable at a different point in time. So some academics have said, let's get rid of the whole concept of personal information. Let's just regulate data. So the problem there is, although privacy is a great field, there's a real danger that if you try to do too much, you wind up doing nothing. And our conclusion is what we really need is a continuum. And the continuum should be matched according to the data and an assessment at a given point of time as to the likely risks to the individual involved.
So a data use regime, really, right?
So looking at the context of the data use and also placing an obligation of accountability on companies so that they will revisit the kinds of data that they are using over time. So one benefit of this more flexible approach is that it will encourage companies to keep information in the least identifiable state possible. Whereas if we go back to the on and off switch, and you have a world in which all kinds of information, almost anything, could become identifiable, there's really no such incentive for the company. Just, make everything identified information and take your punches with it.
So the FTC is updating the kids' privacy rule. And so we'll talk in a minute maybe about what the White House and the FTC are doing generally with proposals for new privacy frameworks. But one thing that we know will happen is that the FTC will, after it finishes assessing the comments it got, it will promulgate a new privacy rule. And one of the things it said is we need in the context of children, expand the definition of personal to include precise location, but also to include tracking a kid with a cookie across sites. And if it's a behavioral profile, if it's linked to not a name, but just an ID or an IP address or the like, and you're tracking a child, then we're going to call that personal even if a name isn't attached to it. Are they doing, to some degree, is that what you're calling for? Saying that depending on the context, something might be personal, even though maybe an adult with a profile that's not personal? Is that?
Okay, so there are two things going on there, it seems to me. One of which is looking at risk. And if you think there's a heightened risk, then the information that is identifiable should indeed receive protection. And then the other thing is looking at the context of the data use to say, this is really not unidentified information. The chance, the likelihood of that the person be identified is so great that we are going to give it appropriate privacy protections.
So let me ask you all to respond to this, and we're going to start bringing in some of you. So in a very short period of time, the White House is going to release a new privacy report, a white paper. We know that the president, the administration will, for the first time, formally have a call for national comprehensive privacy legislation of some sort, a Bill of Rights to enshrine some key privacy principles into law. But we also know that Congress is not going to very quickly jump on that. Maybe they will at some point, but we know that they're going to lead as well with an effort to create multi-stakeholder groups where they want to bring together advocates and businesses and other stakeholders to hash out self-regulatory practices that the Federal Trade Commission, if it deems adequate, will create a safe harbor around, and then companies will be on the hook. So it's a way to sort of bridge the rigidness of a law with sort of a flexible thing. But the key is that different stakeholders are at the table. It's not just companies figuring it out, it's multi-stakeholder. So would the ACLU come to the table and be part of that sort of multi-stakeholder approach? Do you need a veto if you're going to come to the table? Are the folks in this room going to be able to say, my industry, we should be the ones who are self-regulated? What topics are the right topics that should be the first ones that groups should come together around and willingly create a code of conduct? Are any of you going to participate if you're invited to do so?
Well, I think the civil liberties groups are always happy to come to the table and talk if it means that there's going to be forward progress. Self-regulation sometimes has its limitations, as we've seen over and over and over again. So, will it solve all the problems? Unlikely. Will it move us in the right direction? Quite possibly. ACLU lawyers, we're eternally optimistic lot. So,
Nick, should location be one of the first ones that we take here?
There's a lot of hot issues. I mean, location is one of the top concerns of consumers. There was some research last year that privacy was the top issue for mobile device users. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion of it with the FTC. I mean, everyone's talking about location. So location is a very important issue, but there's also many, many other issues. Cloud computing is an important issue. The overall areas of, content and transactional data. There's a lot of things going on right now. and we're going to need a lot of different actors to be taking parts of that. I've been very pleased over the past year and a half to 2 years to see how much conversation has really grown in this area. You started, Jules, by talking about how much it's in the press. You know, there's so much media attention on this issue. We've had investigations and white papers. We've had congressional hearings. We've had over a dozen pieces of legislation introduced in the past year. We have Supreme Court cases coming down. So, you know, I believe we're at a turning point, finally, after a lot of years where there has been this exponential increase in technology and really a holding pattern in terms of privacy progress.
Do you all agree that there needs to be a law? I mean, we're going to have a call for some version of a law. Microsoft's been on record supporting privacy, the right privacy law at the right time, right? Paul, sounds like you think protecting privacy by law is necessary?
So there are a lot of tricky questions regarding a privacy law. And so one of them, for example, is going to be preemption and the role of the states, and also the extent to which a general privacy law should be overridden by more specific sectoral laws regarding that particular area of data use. But would a general privacy law, if we got it right, help? I think it would, because I think it would level the playing field for different kinds of companies.
Nick, you're a startup. You don't even know what the future will bring. Is a privacy law going to foreclose some great innovative business that is in the glint of your eye or someone else's?
I sincerely doubt that it would foreclose it, because at the end of the day, even if the privacy, even if communication of very specific aspects of bits of applications at the level at which our users are experiencing them were mandated by law, which they currently are in some very rare instances, but mostly they aren't. We just use best practices. As we kind of, to loop back to the thing I was talking about before, people don't really read them, so I'm not really sure that if they were mandated by law, it would make that big a difference to users. What I think would make a big difference from the mandated by law aspect is the spirit within which these services would be designed and created. Because ultimately, if you're out to create a service for which the ultimate product is actually the users using the service, and that's really the only thing you care about, then yeah, law is going to make a big difference, because it'll prevent you from creating a service like that from scratch to begin with. We're not of the size that we worry about that sort of thing, because we're focused strictly on solving a user pain point. So from our point of view, our business is solving the user's pain point, as opposed to going, okay, we got all these people, let's data mine the shit out of them and do something with that data. So yeah, it's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but I hope I've answered it.
Thank you. Jim, law, no laws?
Yeah, I think the risk of some comprehensive law, I mean, it could mean the risk of a privacy overreach could result in an innovation underreach. And that's my biggest concern, is that legislation is a chainsaw, and where often a scalpel it can be most effective. We just went through SOPA, as Stop Online Piracy Act, and not privacy, piracy, and I think that was a real dilemma between intellectual property rights and free speech, really. And so I think we need to be careful to let loose the Kraken here and just hope that everything kind of turns out okay, because once this legislative juggernaut starts, it's kind of hard to get it to act responsibly and still allow innovation to flourish. I mean, I look at the European Union, and outside of Skype, I struggle to think of one really hot company that's come out of the European Union.
Do you think
it's maybe Spotify, but that's kind of got a U.S. DNA.
But do you think it's because they have a privacy law, or is it something to do with
I think there's a piece of it, and it might be innovation culture, but it may be this sort of, we are a bit of a ready, shoot, aim culture in the U.S. And which serves us well. There are definitely harms that come from it, and we have a regime in the U.S. where enforcement is very tough, but very focused. Where in the EU, it's very aspirational, and it's not enforced as aggressively. And I think that serves us well in the U.S. actually.
As a small point, by the way, as an entrepreneur who's had startups in Europe and here, I strongly agree with that. Although, as it happens, I don't think a big part of it is privacy. Single biggest thing that the U.S. has going for it from an entrepreneurial level, which is absolutely massive, is actually not the ready availability of venture capital, although that's huge, but it's the fact that people aren't scared to fail. And that's awesome. Because basically, you know, they say that you learn more from failure than from success, but the fact is failure is practically encouraged because risk-taking is encouraged, whereas in Europe, it still feels like it's 30 years ago where people go, no, you can't do that because you might screw up. Well, that's kind of the point. We don't really know. Right. No, don't do that. So unfortunately, innovation is massively stifled there, but that's a whole separate panel.
Totally agree. Yeah, so, yeah, you got to build the plane while you're flying it.
So
I think you do.
So let's hear from some of you. And I call on people if you don't raise your hand. So trustee, if there's a law, do I need a privacy seal? Because there's a law. In Europe, we don't see very broad adoption of privacy seals, perhaps to some degree because, well, there's a law. I don't need a privacy seal. So where does sort of a privacy seal fit in when are these compatible? What do you folks think? Yes, 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 yes.
Well, I work for the state government in the assembly, and one of the jobs that I have is I write these laws. And I do believe that the laws that we write are floors. And so, yes, I do believe that we should have a floor established, and then competition would drive the folk to build, you know, higher and better and communicate better and more completely with their folks. And then that's how it would build upon that. So yes, I would say that there's a place both for the privacy policies and the law.
Oh, the trustee shareholders are in good stead. Yes. Raise your hands. Ask us what you will, because otherwise we will ask you. Thoughts on whether you think that, are you optimistic that privacy has become a big enough issue that if the administration introduces... Oh, Jack.
Hey, Jules, how you doing? Hey, so question for the...
Say who you are. Jack Yang from Visa.
Yes, that's right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for a very informative panel. So question for you. There's a lot of discussion in the privacy community about not just the law, but also what is referred to as accountability. So you guys actually didn't touch on that topic today. I'm just curious about where you stand on basically corporate accountability for basically abiding by the laws that may be passed or abiding by industry best practices or otherwise, and what are good solutions for accountability at the end of the day?
Jules?
We think of accountability as sort of the how, if you will. So the what is what you're going to do, and accountability sort of describes the how you're going to carry it out. From our perspective, a lot of the things that go into our corporate governance program map back to accountability. So having a chief privacy officer, having standards in place, demonstrating these elements that are part of the accountability regime, and that's something that we're in favor of.
Next question.
Carl Hewitt. There was an article in the New York Times today about the new proposed European privacy law. I wonder if any of you had a chance to see it. There was a remark in this article that often Europe is a leader in privacy law that's often then adopted by the rest of the world. And if you're aim to be an international corporation or already are one, how the hell do you avoid it?
So tomorrow, or maybe now, right, tomorrow in Europe, the actual text of the proposed European Commission privacy regulation will be released, but a draft of it leaked out a month or two ago, and Vivian Redding has been previewing some of the sexier parts of this law. One of the pieces of it, for instance, initially was going to call for penalties of up to 5% of a company's revenue. Evidently, that's been reduced to only 2% of your global revenue, which can still, I guess, be an awful lot of money if you're a big company. And there are a range of other measures. How does a company doing business globally, or do any of you have any reaction? Nicole, is this going to be a model for the U.S.? Paul, have you seen sort of some of the framework of the Europeans getting it right? Jules, are you worried about the changes?
I think that, in fact, over time there has been a harmonization at a lot of companies around the European principles, that they've leveled up to their strict standards. The difficulty is that, as someone has said, a kind of hell on earth is European-style privacy law and U.S.-style enforcement. So it has certainly been difficult for U.S. corporations, and we'll find out what the new directive looks like tomorrow or later today.
And innovation may suffer because of it. I mean, that's the real risk here, is that it's great to say, okay, I have this aspirational privacy regime, but then when you have U.S.-style enforcement, you may end up, as Nick, you said, where people are very concerned about failing, because failing could mean a huge judgment and the end of your company.
But people often say, well, innovation's going to be stifled. But what I've seen, with U.S. companies that have, spoken to me about things that they're going to release, and I've noted privacy issues related to that, and they've said, oh, we can't fix that. It's too hard. We don't know how to do that. And then lo and behold, the EU has gone after them, and they found a way to work around it. So I'm not divulging any names, but I'm sure you guys can think of a few where, the product has worked just fine, and privacy has been built in, and had we had some of those standards, then hopefully it would have been built in earlier and actually saved the company a lot of money and time down the line.
Will this proposal from the U.S. be helpful at all in showing the Europeans that we have serious privacy measures? It seems that some are optimistic that it will help bridge or slow down the process or influence the process. Do they care whether we have a privacy law or if we have one that's good enough? How is this going to play out in the U.S.-EU relationship? Anybody have a sense?
Well, I think just one thing to add is thinking back to 10 years ago, the U.S. companies didn't have a corporate governance program in place. And if you fast forward then to 2012, every U.S. corporation that's of any given size has CPO. They have corporate governance programs. So we've really moved considerably towards the EU model already.
I would just add that the fact that we see there's a process moving in the EU, there's processes moving here in other parts of the world. I mean, this is evidence of this muddling through during this period of disequilibrium where people are trying to find what the right regime, what the right uses are. And I think it's evidence that we're moving in that direction. To Nikki's point, maybe we're at some kind of a cusp. We'll see.
Next question.
Yeah, this is a question mostly directed at Paul. Legally, I thought there was some sense of having to demonstrate injury in order for something wrong to be committed. That is to say, if you do something and it doesn't hurt anybody, does it really matter? If you do something illegal. In this case, I'm wondering if privacy infractions matter if they don't actually result in me being bothered. And maybe I start to notice the targeting of ads and that's why I'm bothered, or more importantly, maybe I start to get offers in the mail because I signed up for a CVS loyalty card. But in the absence of those, how do we parse out the sort of legal conceptual behind this?
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I'm sure Nicole will have something to add as well. But what you're saying is no harm, no foul. Or as the Supreme Court Justice once said, it's a very short trip into the garbage can if you don't like the piece of mail. At the same time, however, and so absolutely, privacy law has really struggled with defining privacy harms in a lot of contexts. At the same time, the law has found that, for example, a lack of transparency, a broken privacy promise, a inadequate explanation of what you were doing constitutes a violation of the law. And so it's really not enough to say, well, you just got some mail, or we just collected that information and didn't do anything about it, because companies have paid million-dollar fines because they didn't adequately explain what they were doing to the consumer. And that's just the reality of the law. Nicole, did you?
Next question.
Hey, James Temple, San Francisco Chronicle. Going back to the European principles issue, there's this clear bifurcation going on right now on the issue of the right to be forgotten. And it's, as a journalist, it's one that I actually struggle with a lot, because I can see why we might want to ask Google to not index the results that lead to the address of a a domestic violence victim, but on the other hand, I can see politicians and criminals wanting SF Gate or the New York Times to erase past stories on them that were unflattering in various ways. So I'm just curious if you have any ideas on how do we balance the free speech rights against the privacy rights on an issue like that.
So one of the big challenges, of course, is that the Europeans don't necessarily have the same view about some of these free speech rights that we perhaps see trumping in a significant way, right, number one. And number two, some of these proposals, it's hard to understand sometimes what we're arguing about when we talk about this right to delete. I think we all probably agree that if I post something, I should be able to take it down. And yeah, there have been some issues, right? Facebook wasn't well enough letting me completely delete it, and now they are. And so, you know, sometimes companies haven't well made it easy enough for me to delete the stuff I want to delete. The Europeans seem to acknowledge that there's going to be some right for newspapers in media, and yeah, let's see how they draw the line between, you know, the Guardian and the blogger who thinks he's, you know, a more important, you know, media outlet, and so that'll be sort of a challenge. But I think the bigger question is, when Nicole posts something about me, Jules did too much talking as a moderator tonight, and she puts that on her blog, and I'm offended, and I want her to take it down, do I have the right? The Europeans, I think, would say, yes, you have the right to do so. And in the US, we'd say, that's an opinion, and that is protected. And I think that's where we're probably going to see the clash. I assume we all would agree that whether it's a legal right or just, you know, what company shouldn't let you take down the stuff you put there on your site. I guess for some of the companies who may see data as their commercial data, that is their right to know about you. I sold you something, it's in my database. What do you mean you can delete it? It's also my data. I have the right to know that you bought something from me. The Europeans would say, no, I have the right to trump, right? And so sometimes when we debate this right to delete, it seems like we're debating 5 or 6 different issues. One is the opinion, one is the free speech, one is the shouldn't the technology, you know, some of it we all ought to agree on, and some of it we just have different views around values. Anybody else want to comment on that? Should there be a right to delete?
It's a fascinating topic and one that we don't have enough time to talk about tonight, but I would direct anyone who's interested in this issue to the very fine article written by my colleague Chris Conley, who's in the audience, if he can raise his hand. He did a very good article about this specific issue on the privacy and free speech issues for the Codex conference for Stanford last year, because it's an issue that's not just been resonating in the EU, but Berkeley did some nice research on this as well, with something upwards of 89–90% of the respondents saying that they should have a right to delete. So it's an issue that's been moving around in academic circles and that we responded to in this article. So if anyone wants a copy of that, I'm sure Chris can get a copy for you.
I guess what I would add is, so the concept of a right to be forgotten or delete is not completely unknown to U.S. law. And the example would be the Fair Credit Reporting Act, a 1970s law, which says that companies have to use current information defined in the law when making decisions whether to grant or deny credit. So a freshness of data concept. At the same time, as Jules has said, absolutely, the First Amendment tradition in the U.S. is really quite different than that in Europe. And there's just a different kind of culture about that in the U.S., and that's going to be a difficult discussion.
And one of the issues is as the data travels, that it's not just sent from me to Jules, but that it goes to another party or it gets spread around the internet. You know, what happens to the data then? Can you retrieve it from all of these places? How would it work practically? So there are both the constitutional issues, there's the practical issues, there's the conflict between those issues. So it's a fascinating area that has a lot of nuances.
I just had one point. I mean, there is this tension between discretion and disclosure, and I think that what's often lost in some of these discussions is we are mapping our human existence, our societal existence online, and when are we in public and when are we not in public? I was leaving a Mariners game last season, and I'm walking up the ramp leaving the game, this girl's taking pictures of everyone leaving the stadium. And I could expect that through facial recognition, I would be tagged, that picture would be loaded onto Facebook, and everybody would know that, hey, saw Jim at the game. And I think I'm in a public place. My expectation of privacy is relatively low. And I think we have to understand that this isn't necessarily just entities, private entities interacting. We're actually being public online, and we have to take that into consideration as we look at these scenarios.
Well, so let's talk about that for a second, because you used to be able to be public in a public space and assume that you were fairly obscure. And companies have always said, look, I get if it's private, making it public is going to create an issue. But what we've seen recently with social media sites is that there's information that is available, but it's obscure, and now it is made more visible, and sometimes that seems to create a big backlash, and people like it, and sometimes it creates a big backlash, and people don't like it. So when Facebook turned on News Feed, lots of people didn't like it. I think 1 million people joined a group, Facebook, stop stalking us, when Facebook had 10 million users. That's a lot of the audience. And then we all started really liking it because we kept track of what each other were doing and without visiting each other's pages, right? And so we can see those food pictures flying by. And Facebook kind of had the courage or the gall or both to say, no, we think this is what you're going to like. And we didn't. And then we loved it. And it became a huge driver of sort of what it means to use social media. But other times, people are complaining about Google+, that results are being made more available or differently available. Nicole and I were talking beforehand about that there's less friction, and that has created concern. So can we deal with it? It's easy to say public is public and private is private, and you shouldn't change that without my permission. But can we stop progress? Can we say court records weren't available, technology makes them more available, we need to make it harder to protect privacy? Is that a model? How do we deal with the fact that my face in public used to be obscure, and now because of facial recognition, my face in public means I can be identified? Is this hopeless? Is there a model for this?
But 150 years ago, your face wasn't obscure in public. We lived in small towns. Everybody saw each other. There was a lot of recognition of each other because we've had 150 years of increased density, anonymity with growing population in cities. So we are the world is shrinking. I mean, someone friended me from Miami from high school 30 years ago, and I'm dating myself, and 3,000 miles away, and I haven't seen this person in that long. And so the world is really shrinking. And so how do we deal with that? And I think we do have some models, actually, if we go kind of not last generation, but 5, 6 generations ago.
But this was one of the larger themes that also was woven in the Supreme Court Jones case. The reality is that you're driving the car, and one of the fundamental questions was, if they can track you, if they're police and they can track you physically, they can follow you in an unmarked car, can they put a GPS device on your car for a month and get all that data? And I think that one of the fundamental things is that privacy is protected by law, or it's often protected by inefficiency. And if the inefficiency is gone, you have to have the law come in to support that. And so I think we could make that argument with any number of the things, whether it's facial recognition or anything else, but we have to figure out the world that we want to live in and create the protections to support that.
Since we're not supposed to disagree, supposed to agree, let me disagree. I think when it comes to the government, you're absolutely right, because the power disparity is so huge that we need to have, as Paul said at the top of the talk, constitutional protections when power disparity is large. But on Facebook and with people that we live in and work with, the power disparity is much smaller. Even when the power disparity is relatively unlevel, like your employer, you have Fair Credit Reporting Act protections on those uses. So I think you got to look at the players involved and the power disparity among the players. You got to look at the space involved. Was Antoine Jones' car a private place or not? Turns out, from the government's perspective, it is a private place. And then what are the perils here? What can go wrong? And I think if you look at it on those axes, you can start to say, What's inappropriate for law enforcement might be quite appropriate for your spouse or for your friend.
The problem is that everyone's in a different situation.
And that's
so,
human.
I mean,
That's humans.
Facebook changed its privacy settings and took away the privacy settings for fan pages, and we got calls from, a student at a local college who was a fan of an LGBT group, and he was outed to his small town in the South because of that change. So everyone's in a different situation, and it comes back to what you were saying, Jim, about control, because it isn't necessarily one size fits all, but everyone needs to be able to be in a position to make their own decisions.
I agree. I agree.
In your example of the photo at the Mariner game, though, it's hard for you to have control of that situation because she took a photo of you or he took a photo of you, and maybe that is a suggestion that some of the rules should be tied to the subsequent use of the data, in cases where you have no control.
Yeah, I agree. Kim, our final question.
Thank you. Paul, you mentioned the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and I'm wondering if you ever see anything like a reputation index where people could get access to that information and learn so much more about you than just what your finances are like.
Yeah, so that's a fascinating...
And how might it be used?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating idea that builds on what Jim was talking about, I think, which is giving consumers actually useful information. So something Nicole's talked about, so that you go on your Google dashboard and you find out they think you're a sports fan, but you're not, and you alter it. The difficulty is, and I'm speaking as a law professor, there are just so many places right now where there are these little bits of your information that you might want to consolidate or correct that would be a full-time job. And then on the other hand, there are all kinds of arguments not to want to have that centralized. So it's really, really tough.
Well, in the early days of Facebook, I got hooked, and my wife was a bit perturbed because here I came home at the end of a long day, and there I am in my office, friending this person, poking that one, and I'm saying, honey, I have to understand this is, part of my job. It's important. So I figured, okay, I'll make it up to her. And there was an app. It was, the fun wall, or the slide wall, whatever it was. It let you send a smoochy, sparkly kiss that said, it's kind of, I love you, honey, so much. And this seemed like a really cool app. And I figured I'll send my wife this smoochy kiss on Facebook, and she'll appreciate that, I'm thinking of her and look and see some of the charm in this. So I download the fun wall, and I click send, and then I'm like, wait, I didn't choose who to send it to. How am I sending it? And of course, in the early days, a lot of the apps, they wanted to be viral, so they pre-checked all of your friends. All right, no big deal. It's a little embarrassing that I'm sending a kiss to several hundred of my colleagues, friends, old girlfriends. No big deal. I post on the top of my page, friends, I do care about you all, but I love only my wife. This app has turned me into an over-ambitious spammer. I figured it'll be no big deal. But it turns out that Facebook's first chief privacy officer, our friend Chris Kelly, he was on the job. And Facebook, to combat apps that might spam you, had put in a rate limiting feature. So you could not actually send a message to 500 people at once. They trickled it out, 10 or 15 a day over the next, I don't know. So I heard from various friends for months and months, I got something really strange from you the other day. My wife claims she's actually never received this thing. So for those of you in the audience, that's why you got that kiss from me. I thank my fellow panelists for their time, and thank you for being a great audience, to Microsoft for sponsoring, and the Churchill Club for hosting another fabulous event. Thank you all.
Just want to say thanks again for sharing your perspectives and insights so freely. We really do appreciate it. As a small gesture of our thanks, we present you with the much coveted Churchill Club t-shirt given only to speakers on our stage. Thank you again to our program partner and sponsor, Microsoft Trustworthy Computing, If you want more information about our topic tonight, or if you didn't get a chance to watch the video out in the hall that was playing during the reception, Microsoft has put together a number of pieces that you can access on the website. Just listen for a moment, please. Microsoft.com/privacy/DPD. I guess that's a wrap. Good night.